Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
So I wonder if we might all agree that truth should be universal. Whatever religion it comes from, whether it comes from the scientific understanding of the world, that the universe is here as an entity with a single truth. Now, each religious teacher, when they appear, faces the challenge of how to bring truth to their contemporary times. And Gurdjieff appeared in the early 20th century, where already science was viewed as one of the important aspects of understanding reality. In this way, he differs from all previous teachers. So, when he first presents his ideas, he presents them in a scientific package. So, for example, as scientists, we make observations, we collect data, we try not to have preconceived notions, however difficult that may be. And a central aspect of Gurdjieff's method is objective self-observation. Assume nothing. Believe nothing. Only know what you know from your own self-verification. This is scientific. It's the method of the scientist. He also, to the, when you're talking to lay people and you're going to write something, they say, they're not going to be diagrams, are there? No numbers. But Gurdjieff uses diagrams and numbers. So in the presentation of the food diagram, there's a diagram, numbers, and the three different kinds of energies, if you like, the food that we ate for breakfast, the air we're breathing, particularly with the active element oxygen, the impressions that we receive from the world. And if these are only taken in, and as an ordinary animal, we have the diagram on the left-hand side, forming the most active refined element, C12, in the bottom right-hand corner, which can be used for the generation of a new life. But he says that through the active struggles of self-observation and the much more mysterious self-remembering, it is possible to generate a whole array of finer substances. And these finer substances would be the fuel for the higher intellectual center, the higher emotional center, and the coding of higher being bodies. It's great, isn't it? It's just a diagram laid out there, and you can see exactly what you need to do. Of course, the challenge is infinite in really trying to understand what this is, but it's a kind of map. And it's not something that would have been presented thousands of years ago. It's something that reflects Gurdjieff's attempt to bring knowledge in a package that would be accessible to the modern world. He also raises the question of what is the sense and aim of human existence? Why are we here? So this has its personal element. Why am I here? But here is also this room, all of us together, this world we can see outside the window, even perhaps this universe. The sense and aim of human existence is inevitably related to the reality of the larger world. And he presents ideas of the larger world that are simply remarkable. He proposes there's a universe. And this image that you're seeing on the slide is when the James Webb Telescope, the wonderful new instrument in the heavens, opened its lens to a speck of sky the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length. Just opened the lens and watched for a long time. And the light from the universe came in. And in that little speck of the universe, every one of those dots is a different galaxy. Thousands of them in this image alone, in that one speck, leading to the estimate of 200 billion galaxies in the universe. That's the largest scale through which things like the Big Bang can be discovered. Now, when Gurdjieff was presenting these ideas in the early 20th century, not a single galaxy had been discovered. It wasn't even known whether there was more beyond the Milky Way. So I find that remarkable. Now, if you go down to the next level of the cosmos, it would be the individual galaxy. Of course, we can't see ours from the outside, but we can see our nearest neighbor, Andromeda. And Andromeda has 200 billion stars. We can go down to the next level, which would be the individual star. This is our star, the sun. And that little black speck that you can see is the Earth to scale. That's its size. It makes sun worship seem reasonable, doesn't it? So, Earth, our planet, 8 billion of us living on it, and we go down to the next smaller scale of cosmos, the human being on the Earth, potentially able to appreciate it. And within the human being, we're made up of cells, about 1 trillion of them. So we have the cosmos of the cell. This is called a eukaryotic cell. It has a nucleus and all kinds of organelles and things within it. And within this cell are about 100 million atoms. So we go down to the next scale. This is the carbon atom. You can see the nucleus on this figure, but in fact, the nucleus is so small, if it were presented here, you wouldn't be able to see it. If the nucleus were the size of this building, the size of the atom would be the size of the Earth. Now, at the time of Gurdjieff, the hydrogen atom had been discovered, and it was proposed that this was the smallest and most fundamental form of matter. And he said, these sorry scientists, they think that the hydrogen atom is the smallest unit, but in fact, there are far smaller cosmoses that they simply don't realize. So, a few decades later, the discovery of the subatomic particles, quarks. Each neutron and proton is made up of 3 quarks, and the quarks are 10 to 100,000 times smaller than the neutron or proton are. From the infinitely small, inconceivably small, to the infinitely large, inconceivably large, he makes an awesome statement. There are common laws that apply to all of these scales. And he called them law of 3 and the law of 7. So, as a scientist, this is so intriguing. Is there some kind of common law that we could understand that would apply across the whole range of scales of the universe? So even though the particular physical laws differ on the different scales, there would be some common principles that we would be able to understand. And so this leads to his striving, one of the 5 strivings in Ashiata Shiyamash, to learn ever more and more concerning the laws of world creation and world maintenance. And he says, take the understanding of the East and the knowledge of the West, and then seek. So, this is great. He likes science. He likes scientists. He likes me. But when you read Beelzebub, he says this. So it raises the question, what would be the proper practice of science? What, as practitioners of science, how would we need to change our behavior to be real scientists? And he is very laudatory of real scientists in Beelzebub and deplores the practice of science as it's made today. We make nuclear weapons, we construct artificial foods, we make ever more active ways of killing one another. We're interested in fame and money, in laurels. So it raises the question for me, what would be the practice of being a real scientist? He raises that question. Now, one of the problems with scientists is that they have a tendency to wiseacre and make up theories and tell stories and so on. So I'm a scientist of new formation, and I'm going to risk telling you a story. And it's going to be the story of the Earth, which formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And the surface of the moon tells us a lot about this early history because it's very old, and you see it's pockmarked, and that's because of all the incoming craters that have gone on and impacted its surface. That's what Earth would look like today if Earth had not gone through a process of evolution. That's not what we see outside the window. We don't see this sort of dead surface. So Earth had water. It was large enough to retain an atmosphere, and it developed a stable climate early in its Earth history. And through receiving energy from the sun and interacting with the Earth materials, life was able to form. And we think this happened about 3.8 billion years ago. And the life would have been extremely simple, akin to the simplest cell we know of today, which is called a prokaryotic cell. It's not like the one I showed you a few minutes ago. It doesn't have a nucleus, it doesn't have organelles. It's only 1 micron in size, a millionth of a meter. It divides every 20 minutes. And all of this happens in the absence of oxygen. So this life is initially anaerobic. It's a hard life for this life. But nonetheless, it covers the surface of the Earth and makes a kind of a first bodily film, if you like, covering the Earth's surface. All of these organisms interact with one another. They evolve. And after a few hundred million years, they make a great discovery which allows them access to more energy from the sun. Now, they were able, through photosynthesis, to use common ingredients, carbon dioxide and water, and through absorbing energy from the sun to make their own food and structures. They could make sugar. Carbon dioxide and water were overwhelmingly abundant. Life could thrive and grow and become infinitely more expansive on the Earth's surface, but there was a problem. That photosynthesis creates this very active element, oxygen, and because life formed in the absence of oxygen, and oxygen is so highly reactive, it's very destructive. It's why we eat broccoli and blueberries, okay, antioxidants. So there was this balance between life receiving the energy from the sun, but also forming this pollutant or poison, which was very destructive for life. So how do you solve this? You go on for hundreds of millions of years with this conundrum. But then life makes an amazing discovery, which is that if you are able to use the oxygen, to use this active element, then you get 18 times as much energy from a single molecule of sugar. So early life was the reactions on the top, creating 2 of these energy molecules, ATP. But if you respire the same molecule in the presence of oxygen, you get 18 times as much energy. That's an energy revolution. And so the prokaryotes got together, they formed partnerships, they developed the ability to carry out this kind of process, and they generated a new kind of cell, the eukaryotic cell, like I showed you a little while ago. It's in the upper right there. It has a nucleus, it has organelles. Oh my God, I have 0 minutes.
It's got 100, yeah, 1.5 billion years
Yes. So it's a real cellular machine, okay? It's an amazing transformation. It's like a second body of life. It doesn't destroy the one underneath. I'm going to start talking quickly. So then the oxygen begins to build up in the atmosphere, and because the oxygen is there, the Earth absorbs it. And you have to saturate the surface of the Earth with oxygen. You saturate the surface of the Earth with oxygen, then it can build up in the atmosphere, and suddenly there's the opportunity to breathe. That makes the possibility of multicellular life like this beginning about 600 million years ago. The multicellular life evolves, it develops a spine, and though you develop this kind of third body of life on the surface of the Earth, the prokaryotes are still there. There are a trillion of them in each of us. The eukaryotic cells are still there, and the multicellular world is there. And then we consider what happens with humans. So humans have more access to energy, right, through fossil fuels initially. And we have also this scale of relationship of being able to communicate through language, then wiring the planet with wires, and then the internet. So it's the greatest revolution in energy and relationship in human history. We're able to sense the entire planet. And so planets seem to go through various stages of evolution. At every stage, the planet evolves or goes down. The evolution of intelligent life and civilization is the most recent and greatest of these revolutions. And so we're at the initial stage of the largest planetary chain in 4.6 billion years of Earth history. So we're a potential instrument. We have a potential instrument of planetary consciousness, or we're a potential planetary cancer. Is this development of planetary consciousness the next stage in planetary evolution that might be common throughout the universe? And what would be the role of the individual in trying to help that happen instead of allowing, as Madame de Salzman said very often, without the necessary efforts, the planet will go down? So I have two final thoughts. The first one is that this new scale of energy and relationship that we have, it's destructive. The more we can use energy, the more rapidly we can destroy the planet. And it's not necessarily clear that more connectivity through the internet and so on is an actual advantage for us. This morning, I ended up leaving my phone in my car. It's the first day in a decade I haven't been walking around with my phone in my pocket. It's great. So, is there a different quality of energy that we as human beings have access to, and a different quality of relationship? And so it's not the electricity and the internet that is needed. It's the unique capacity of the human being to relate and receive energy from other levels in the universe. Is that what is needed? Now, Gurdjieff suggests we have three lines of work: work on oneself, work with others, work for the work. That was 100 years ago when a planetary crisis was not evident. Today, 8 billion people. 8 billion. Planetary crisis is everywhere. And if you read Beelzebub and you look at the Ashiatian epic, which he holds up as a model, if we followed those principles, Earth would be saved. So is there a fourth line of work, a fourth that is apparent today that would not have been apparent 100 years ago, but which he prepared us for, which would be work for the planet? And is that wiseacring? Is that something we could experience? Is that something he was preparing us for? Is that a challenge that we would have any way of understanding how to undertake? Thank you.
Good morning. I've been advised to speak slowly, but I only have 15 minutes. So my background's in comparative religion and literature and a bit of cultural studies as well. I think what I'll do is I have a couple of parts of my presentation to introduce a little bit, much of which may be familiar with many of you who are familiar with Gurdjieff's early life, but I'm going to frame some of this early life that he experienced in the Caucasus in terms of this idea of cosmopolitanism. And then I'm going to turn to look at some material in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson in the notion of the Megalocosmos and how that might fit in or accord with the idea of the cosmopolitan. This is a picture from of Mount Ararat with Horvarap in the background in Armenia. Just part of the background culturally, geographically. I'll touch upon that a little bit as we go through this. Born in the late 19th century, Gurdjieff was from the Caucasus region, an area of rich geographical, cultural, and linguistic diversity and influence. And this is not the greatest map here. It's actually a more recent map, but you can see in the pink section, Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia now, and then Gyumri in the top left section of Armenia there is where Gurdjieff grew up. And the idea of cosmopolitanism, which I wanted to introduce briefly, is this idea from Diogenes Laertius, who declared, "I am a citizen of the world." And so there's discussions of cosmopolitanism in the past few decades. Some of it's a bit contested, and I won't go into all the details of that right now, too. But this notion of I am the citizen, a citizen of the world, or cosmos, comes out of this phrase. More recently, Kwame Appiah writes about rooted cosmopolitanism, and that's part of what I want to take up as the angle with which we can maybe usefully talk about Gurdjieff's life and work. He recognizes the importance of rootedness and the local while feeling at home in both the local and the world. So that connection between never losing the root connection. Gurdjieff's cosmopolitanism is reflected in the clues about his upbringing, the multiple languages that he learned, the cultural and religious influences that surrounded him, and his travels, and the evidence and ideas found in his teachings, movements, and writings. So a little bit about the diversity in the background of the Caucasus. Geologically, it contains multiple terrains, microcontinents. The highland geography of the Caucasus contributes to the diversity of the region, including its ethnic diversity, as de Waal writes. Early Arab influences to the Caucasus as the Jabal al-Alsun, or the mountain of languages. The North and South Caucasus together have the greatest density of distinct languages anywhere on the earth. It was an embattled region, particularly so when Gurdjieff was alive, with contested border definitions throughout the region, and that's also an evidence when he was moving from Gyumri or Alexandropol to Kars as well, and moving around the Caucasus, and very much part of his memoirs. Life in Alexandropol was also very rich. I think this is one of the things that gets sort of underestimated and discussed less often. Alexandropol or Gyumri was the third most important cultural city in the Caucasus, behind Tiflis and Baku. It was a center of both folk and high culture. The establishment of the state opera in 1912 is kind of evidence of that high culture representation there as well, and he was influenced by all of that. His father, as we know, was an ashok. It's portrayed in Meetings with Remarkable Men, the film, and it's often talked about too. It's a tradition that continues in Armenia and in Turkey. His father sang poems, songs, legends, folk tales, and stories. And this is part of what I want to say about this, to establish a sense of local rootedness and birthed a desire for a broader, more cosmopolitan connectedness too. So it wasn't just that there was nothing around him, it was a kind of a dry or vacuous place. It was very rich already. And then he also still sought out answers to his bigger questions about the meaning of life on Earth. Other early influences, he spoke Armenian in the reference to the languages of the region, Russian, Greek, Turkish early on, and other languages as he continued his travels. He was surrounded by the Armenian Orthodox Church and its monastic architecture, as well as the liturgy and so on too, as well as the influence of Russian, Georgian Orthodox churches and Greek Orthodox churches as well. And he maintained this connection to Christianity throughout his life too, which becomes evident even in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, as I'll talk about in a little bit. And this is a little passage from Meetings with Remarkable Men, and I think I do keep in mind, too, that I approach this text as a semi-autobiographical text. There's some mythologization or hagiography going on in this text as well, or self-hagiography. But he writes about travels in Caucasia. I visited various monasteries and went to see men about whose piety I had heard, read the Holy Scriptures and the lives of the saints, and was even for 3 months an acolyte of the famous Father Yevlampios in the monastery of Sanahin, which is in northwest Armenia. And I also made pilgrimages to most of the holy places of the many different faiths in Transcaucasia. He traveled further, as we know from his own writings and from later research as well, to Anatolia, to Istanbul, and studied and observed the Mevlevi dervishes there, but also other dervish orders throughout Anatolia, including the Bektashi and the Mevlevi in Konya, and also visited the Christian caves of Cappadocia in central Anatolia. According to his autobiography and what has been pieced together by later biographers, Gurdjieff traveled to Crete, Jerusalem, Rome, and later Central Asia, Siberia, and Tibet. Throughout this early period, what I'm arguing here or presenting here, so I'm just sharing, Gurdjieff's notions of religion, spirituality, and the meaning of life were increasingly developing from a more cosmopolitan viewpoint. I am from the cosmos. I am of the cosmos. So I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. That's what I've done a lot of my own research and work on. And talk about a couple of notions in there. And I'll just pause for 1 second to get my place with my paper. His notion of the cosmopolitan, I argue, was one who was at home in the local, the regional, the global, and the universal. And in his magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, Gurdjieff undoubtedly reflects a cosmopolitan worldview. Beelzebub's Tales is told in the mode of a frame tale, as a dialogue between Beelzebub and Hussein, his grandson, and reflects an influence both direct and indirect from oral storytelling, popular culture, early literary forms that were prevalent in texts of Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe. And I think it's also maybe worth mentioning a sense of humor that also is conveyed there too, which I think was rooted in Gumri particularly as well. He draws on local lore, folk tales, and stories of the Caucasus and the region, but didn't hesitate to criticize them as well, or the ways especially that they'd come down to us from the past. In the introduction, Gurdjieff remarks that the task of his book is to destroy mercilessly without any compromises whatsoever in the mentation and feelings of the reader, the beliefs and views by centuries rooted in him about everything existing in the world. But while respecting fundamental elements of the local, Gurdjieff rejects the privileging of ethnic, national, or regional identities. He embraces them all to some extent. So within the frame of the tales, there are a few things that show up a lot. One is the notion of three-brained beings, so that applies to us, but also other living creatures in the universe at large. And he uses first in chapter 9 this term, tatarto-cosmoses. And in this discussion, he introduces this idea of microcosmoses, then tatarto-cosmoses made up that form the three-brained being, mind, body, and emotions. He continues to talk about this later in the chapter, The Holy Planet Purgatory, 700 pages later, after he introduces these terms first. And let me just get the placement of my slides here. Okay. In the chapter, Beelzebub shares some of the knowledge he learned about the creation of the universe. He says, it was just during this same period of the flow of time there came to our creator, all-maintainer, the forced need to create our present existing Megalocosmos, our world. Beelzebub then goes on to describe how the Megalocosmos contains and operates according to two sacred laws, which we've already heard about a little bit, the law of 3, Triamazi Kamno, and the law of 7, Heptapara Parshanak, in much more detail. And after a lengthy and detailed discussion on the operation of these sacred laws of world creation and world maintenance, And the necessity to change their functioning, Beelzebub shares an important detail to Hussein about the workings of the cosmos. He also describes here how Hussein's favorites, the humans on Earth, are like all other three-centered beings in the universe, or Megalocosmos. And through them, the necessary exchange of substances takes place. So he continues here to discuss the Megalocosmos and the relationship of the individual human being to the Megalocosmos. He continues in his explanation to Hussein and says, each three-brained being arisen on this great planet of yours represents in himself also in all respects, just like every three-brained being in all our universe, an exact similarity of the whole Megalocosmos. The difference between each of them and our common great Megalocosmos is only in scale. The Megalocosmos here, in Gurdjieff's rendering, is represented as the whole cosmos, and the three-brained beings of Earth, just like all other three-brained beings, reflect the structure of the entire Megalocosmos. What is perhaps more potent may be the re-rendering of the notion that the human being is created in the image of God in the next passages. He continues in his conversation with Hussein. Here you should know that your contemporary favorites very often use a notion taken by them from somewhere. I do not know whether instinctively, emotionally, or automatically, and expressed by them in the following words, we are the images of God. And he continues, these unfortunates do not even suspect that of everything known to them concerning cosmic truths, this expression of theirs is the only one, true one of them all. And indeed, each of them is the image of God, not of that God which they have in their bobtailed picturings, but of the real God, by which we sometimes still call our Megalocosmos. So now stated in quasi-scientific language, but resonant with the language of religion, Gurdjieff's view of the human being is now given a new grounding. This new grounding contrasts with the image of God founded upon the inherited images received from the past, which tend to oversimplify God's nature and emphasize God's remoteness. So I'm going to jump a little bit maybe here too, but just to emphasize a couple of points and kind of bring this to a conclusion. Gurdjieff, in these passages in Beelzebub's Tales, and I'm skipping over quite a lot of really dense material, especially in Holy Planet Purgatory about world creation and world maintenance, but he recasts and expands the significance of the human being both scientifically and symbolically with weighty significance. Contained within each three-brained being is the very structure and presence of the Megalocosmos. Beelzebub shares with Hussein, each of your favorites in his whole presence is in every respect exactly similar to our Megalocosmos. So in this sense, it's just to kind of sum that point up is we're kind of moving, Gurdjieff moves us from I am a citizen of the world to I am a citizen of the Megalocosmos. And the simultaneity that comes out of that is both that we are part of the Megalocosmos and we are also a Megalocosmos within ourselves. So it has this great potency, I think, but also connected with this idea of being created in the image of God, connected to that. So in the end of the tales, Gurdjieff brings up a couple of points about the role of the human being, which is one of the aims of exploration in the book. And just to the red text there, he says, the highest aim and sense of human life is the striving for the welfare of one's neighbor, and that this is attainable only through the conscious renunciation of one's own. So this rooted cosmopolitanism brings him back to teachings and ethical perspectives that he grew up with in the Caucasus as well. And just to conclude, to add a little point on this, to say a cosmopolitanism of compassion. It's not just about being in the world or being reflective of the world, but it's about how we treat other beings and how that leads us to this connectedness inwardly and externally. Echoing this aim in a talk of 1941, Gurdjieff connects this capacity to the relationship one has with one's parents as a generative impulse. He says, love of your neighbor, that is the way. Bring to everyone that which you felt for your parents.
supposed to say something about the understanding of the East. It's impossible for anybody to really understand the East. It is so large. In fact, I once asked a very well-known professor, T.R.V. Murthy, highly regarded, that there are so many sacred texts in India. Does he know anybody who ever read all of them? He says, that is possible, but I have never met anybody who has read all the sacred texts in India. So when I speak about the understanding of the East, it's a very minor little version of the East. East is enormously large. And another thing I want to say here, you probably all know this, that Gurdjieff called himself a Hindu when he published his, in the beginning of the 20th century, Struggle of the Magicians. The word Hindu or India, neither one of them come from the Indian languages. What the so-called Hindus call their religion is Sanatana Dharma, which literally means eternal law. And anybody who connects with that, such as Christ or Rumi, officially they are Hindus. So possibly Gurdjieff could rightly call himself a Hindu, which is what he did. So one needs to understand that Hindu doesn't refer to any particular historical person or a particular historical text. It is really a call to connect with Sanatana Dharma, eternal law. But quite understandably, everywhere, serious ideas go downhill. This is the law of seven doesn't stop working just because Gurdjieff has died. it always worked. So some of the major ideas in any religious tradition, ideas or practices gradually go downhill. And so I specifically would take 2 or 3 examples which Gurdjieff specifically refers to. Kunda buffer. He's especially talking about the idea of Kundalini, which is basically something arising really from the sexual center, as if this is going to make one enlightened gradually. And this notion has been by serious yoga teachers, for example, in the Yajnavalkya in the 10th century, or even modern yoga teachers like Deshikachar, who was the son of the greatest yoga teacher in the 20th century. They point out that Kundalini is basically leading to avidya, ignorance. However, at the ordinary level, it has been highly regarded as a way of connecting with enlightenment. Everywhere, ideas go downhill. So quite rightly, Gurdjieff points out that, by the way, he actually refers to Kundalini as Kundalina in Beelzebub. And then from there comes the idea of the Kunda buffer, trying to point out that this is really an obstruction rather than something helpful. Another thing that he, as you know, he calls his teaching as Haida Yoga. Why refer to it as yoga? Haida literally means, I gather in Russian, it means quick yoga. Something that one can very easily accomplish, not easily, but quickly accomplish. But again, I just want to point out, if you look at any of the serious yoga practitioners like Raman Maharishi or Vivekanand or Aurobindo, they are obviously trying to point out exactly the enormous requirement of the practices in yoga, including practically all the things that Gurdjieff will speak about as necessary for practice. However, it is true that at an ordinary level, naturally things are always, how can I quickly get some result from this? Most people who practice yoga, especially I notice this, there are many yoga schools in North America here, in the USA, they are just trying to increase their sex appeal. There's not any harm in this, but, but that is not the purpose of yoga. As I just mentioned, if you look at any serious yoga teachers in contemporary times, like Iyengar or Deshikachar, These are also more or less emphasizing physical yoga, but the ones who have actually seriously engaged with yoga, like Vivekananda, Raman, Aurobindo, I mentioned. So there are many aspects of yoga which are constantly forgotten, but this is true of every teaching. I actually keep asking, seriously, I ask even myself, referring to any of the practitioners of the Gurdjieff work as Haida Yogi, how many of them have come to the level of Madame de Salzman or Gurdjieff? Everywhere there is a natural tendency, and obvious laws are applicable, that every great idea gets practiced or understood at a lower and lower level, at a more larger cosmological level. Same thing has happened with India or in India. And then one of the ideas of Gurdjieff, which people who are opposed to him make as a kind of a joke, and those who are sort of favorites are following Gurdjieff's teaching, they regard this is a wonderful idea, namely that the moon is eating human beings. It can be taken both ways by people who think how ridiculous an idea. I simply want to point out to you the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, mentions exactly this, except that in the Indian tradition, not everybody is a food for the moon. Some of them go to the sun. Those who are accomplished or exalted human beings, they go to the sun, and they are naturally, this is one of the great texts that says that as one goes to the sun door, he will be asked, "Who are you?" If the answer is anything other than nobody, he may not enter. A complete freedom from me. That is the fundamental requirement to understand anything serious. Most of you, since probably come from the Judeo-Christian background, let me remind you a remark of Christ. Unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. This is the Gospel of Matthew. So I just wanted to point out here that this idea of moon eating human beings, first of all, this is in twofold, sun on the moon, and very strong emphasis, especially emphasis in the Kaushtaki Brahmana Upanishad, that the moon eats human beings, then puts them out as rain, so they are reincarnated later on in different versions. And there, after mentioning this, at the end, the question is, who are you? The answer is, I am you. Then he's allowed to enter the door. That oneness with the divine, that is the call. But always a tendency that I need to get ahead, I need to get a Nobel Prize, or that is quite natural human tendencies, and one need not imagine that it is only in the West or only in the East. This is throughout human general, everywhere in the world. So for me personally, having, even my friends hardly find it believable, I ended up teaching courses in the university, in the physics department, in the philosophy department, in the religion department. But then I decided that I needed to actually practice something rather than to teach about something. For me, I actually asked Jean de Salzman, who was my teacher for many years, I can write something about God, give talks about God, or what people have said about God, but how do I touch God? For me, that is much more important than reading about God, talking about God, writing about God. And her response was, which actually brought tears to my eyes. She asked me, if God were right here and he was touching you, what would you do to invite him not only to touch you, but to see that he's embracing you? That, from my point of view, is the real call for any spiritual practice, which I invite you people to see if you can connect with that. Otherwise, one can talk about this or that. As I said, I have taught in many places, many departments, but I'm happy to be free of that now. Thank you.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.